Chapter 13: The Past in a Hellenistic Present, Myth and Local Tradition, by Scheer. Myth as History according to the Greeks. The inhabitants of the history of Tarsus in Cilicia, according to the geographer Strabo, originally came from Argos. They said that Triptolemus was sent by the Argives in search of Io, who first disappeared in Tyre, and that he traveled through Cilicia. There several of his Argive companions left him and founded Tarsus. The strange foundation myth of the Tarsans is a typical example of how people in the Hellenistic period dealt with past and present. We hear for the first time that a search party was sent out to find the Argive princess and priestess, Io. It must have seemed very curious to experts in Greek mythology, and every citizen of a polis counted himself as such, that Triptolemus should have taken on such a task, that ended finally in the founding of cities in distant barbaric places. The relationship of Hellenistic Greeks to their past is shaped by much older traditions. In particular, two important points characterize the relationship to the past: its genealogical structuring and its reshaping by epic poetry. It is already clear from the Homeric epics that the Greeks thought in familiar structures. Who are you? Where do you come from? What is the name of your home city and your parents? These questions are posed in epic when strangers meet. Self-definition as well as assessment by others are marked by genealogical connections. The past of his own family, of his home city, of his tribe defines the identity and status of the individual in the present. Glaucus and Diomedes find out on the battlefield that their families are bound together by ancestral ties of guest friendship. Even much later individuals in Greece set great store by ancestry. But whole cities also prided themselves on their ancestors and founders. Xenophon makes Socrates praise the outstanding descent of the Athenians, and the whole city allegedly talks about the supposed divine origin of the young Athenian Lysis. Herodotus reports that other nations occasionally outdo the Greeks in genealogical ambition, namely when an Egyptian priest responds merely with a smile to the ancestral line of Hecataeus of Miletus, which reaches back 16 generations. The past in the form of genealogy had an effect right up to the present in Greece through the emphasizing of family structures. It gave rise to expectations and claims. These might, for instance, have consisted of territorial claims, but might also have applied to familial behavior. Allied cities and families were expected to stand by each other in war or in economic crisis. This pronounced Greek interest in ancestral and kinship was, however, not properly historical. The past was only of importance when it was marked by famous personalities or by deeds of mythical heroes. A family tree that ended with an anonymous smallholder was of little use. Even as proof of the great age of a family, it could not offer much help. For great age only really began when the genealogy could be traced back to heroic times and thereby into the society of heroes or even gods. Even if there had been a general interest in the authentic past, if the Greeks had looked for objective answers, the problems with the sources would have quickly driven them to the limits of possibility. The knowledge of linear B script had been lost. People were at loss when confronted with written or archaeological discoveries from their own past, which chance had brought to light. The Greeks reconstructed the past not so much through concrete evidence from early times, but rather with the help of their traditional stories of myth. In cases of doubt, an oracle was readily consulted, for instance, when they sought an explanation for the discovery of colossal bones. The answers were bound by the framework of established tradition. It might then emerge, for instance, that they were dealing with the kneecap of Ajax, son of Telamon, from the Homeric epic, or the skeleton of the giant Orontes, which at the same time would provide a plausible explanation for the colossal size of the finds. Similar explanations probably presented themselves in the case of visible remains of buildings from the Mycenaean age. Questions about the past led to heroic, not historically correct, answers. Also, the possibility is not absolutely excluded that historical memory has here and there preserved the reality of early Greece. Already long before Hellenistic times, however, Greek logographers and historians had made the fictional events of epic the focal point of their history and accepted them as containing at least a core of truth. Even Thucydides speaks of the auton of the Athenians, of the naval supremacy of King Minos, and of Trojan War as historical facts from which one only needs to expunge the improbable additions. The swift spread of the Homeric epics throughout Greece had clearly extinguished or at least reshaped real memory. The memory of a more or less exiguous real past was hardly a match for the epic alternative of heroic, martial, marital renown. The connection between epic and self-definition through heredity is established without difficulty if one stresses the role of the ancestors of cities and of individuals in specific mythological incidents. Mythical tradition becomes mythical construct. Already in the ancient world, the Athenians saw themselves confronted with the accusation that they had inserted supposedly appropriate lines into the Iliad. Or else individual families trace their ancestry in a direct line back to epic heroes, the family of Phylides, to which the historian Thucydides belonged, claimed to be descended from Ajax, son of Telamon. The orator Andokides even claimed descent from Odysseus and Hermes. The habit of evaluating the qualities of individual and even of cities on the basis of their ancestry understandably encouraged the desire to number the gods themselves, or at least the heroes of epic, among one's own ancestors. Past and present in the Hellenistic period. The interconnection of past and present reached hitherto unprecedented levels in the Hellenistic period. The basic constants remained the same, the interest in genealogy continued unabated, and the past as refashioned by epic, in which the products of the poetic imagination have taken the place of reality, is established and recognized as a valid representation of the Greek past. What changed and developed, however, was the role that the past played in the present. The immediate cause of this was the upheaval brought about by the campaigns of Alexander the Great. In his treatment of the past, Alexander connected seamlessly with the traditional perception. Already for generations, the Argeades had attached great value to a prestigious ancestral line that went right back to Heracles as its progenitor. The Macedonian royal house, at first not recognized as truly Greek, found it particularly necessary to claim mythological cum historical proof of their noble descent. It was the propagation of a family tree which went back to Argos and Heracles that made possible their admission to the Olympic Games. At the time of Philip II, this ancestry was largely recognized, and significantly in his case it also had an influence on the present. The history of the family imposed one obligation. Thus the political writer Isocrates could present Heracles as a model for his descendant Philip. The deeds of Heracles in the first conquest of Troy were used to legitimate and also oblige Philip to carry out successful military action in the present, that is, the campaign against the Persians. The young Alexander, through his mother, the Epirote Princess Olympias, also counted Achilles, Homer's most courageous hero at Troy, among his ancestors. Through Heracles and Achilles, therefore, Alexander was of divine descent both on his father's and on his mother's side. He had the sea goddess Thetis, the mother of Achilles, and Zeus, king of the gods, the father of Heracles, in his family tree. Alexander, as king, emphasized his connection to a divine, or at least glorious, heroic past, not only through his own ancestry, but also through his conduct. His campaign against the Persians could already be regarded, completely in the tradition of Philip, as a war of vengeance designed to push the outrage previously committed by the Persians in Greece. Furthermore, the action was permeated with repeated allusions to the mythical past. He presented himself as a new fighter against Troy. When he landed on Asiatic soil, he leapt from his ship like Protesilaus before him, and hurled his spear as a gesture of ownership into enemy ground. In addition, he pointedly visited the sites of ancient Ilion and sacrificed in the temple of Athena. He had Trojan weapons from this temple carried ahead of him as a standard from then on. A consequence of well-documented personal interest in the standard from then on, a consequence of well-documented personal interest in the epic that praised his ancestor Achilles. The continued influence of the mythological past on the present is clear. It is the motivating yardstick for the new Achilles. The Greeks abroad. In the course of Alexander's campaign, the interaction of past and present gained a new dimension. The advance of the Macedonian army changed the Greek view of the world. The way they dealt with this expanded, apparently endless, world is significant. They evidently abstained from extravagant advertisement of the claim to be the first to have ever advanced so far. Instead, the stress was placed over and over again on familiar elements in these foreign lands. The geographical opening of the world took place in the footsteps of great forerunners, of gods and heroes from the mythical past. Throughout his campaign, Alexander recognized Greek gods and heroes in foreign lands. He called on them pointedly and paid honor to them. He recognized his ancestor Heracles in the Phoenician Melkart of Tyre. In remote Cilicia, he sacrificed to the Asclepius of Salois and hailed the hero Amphilochus of Malos as a direct relation. The whole campaign of Alexander can be interpreted as a venture following the trail of the mythical past. Like Heracles, who had traveled the world and fought against the barbarians, Alexander too took up the fight with the barbarian foe. In the footsteps of Dionysus, he traveled to India, beyond the boundaries of the known world. In the case of Alexander's campaigns, this emphasis on the mythical past of the Macedonians and Greeks tended to integrate rather than exclude. The aim was by no means a one-sided ennobling of the Macedonians at the expense of the indigenous people whom they encountered. Family relationships based on myth did not have the function of an exclusive patent of nobility. Alexander and his generals endeavored, on the contrary, to establish a connection between Greeks and Persians. Strabo records the creation of a family relationship between the Thessalians and the inhabitants of Armenia and Media, which was promoted by followers of Alexander. This idea of kinship between the inhabitants of Asia and the Greeks was not completely new. Already in the Homeric epic, Greek gods had sons in both camps. One thinks of Aeneas, Sarpedon, and Memnon. Herodotus had already reported that the kings of Lydia were descended from Heracles, and in the run to the Persian wars, Persian envoys are supposed to have come to Argos in an attempt to win the Argives over to their side, by appealing to their mutual mythical ancestor Perseus. This integrating use of the mythical past was not simply an unselfish mark of respect or recognition for non-Greek civilizations on the part of the Greeks. At stake surely was the need to prevent the Greek claim to power from appearing to the conquered as foreign rule. At least as important, however, was the opportunity for the Greeks to take mental possession of these lands. In this aim, the structure of the traditional stories of the Greeks was of considerable assistance. A common method of intellectual subjugation of unfamiliar lands consisted in making them accessible through eponymous heroes. Every river, every tree, every region, according to the Greek view, was inhabited by local supernatural powers. Once the areas which they reached were mythically personalized, then the local family trees could easily be connected to well-known Greek heroes. Indeed, if it was possible to recognize a prominent Greek hero as a progenitor, then the new members could be regarded as having been successfully fitted into the system. But in addition, the propagation of parallels between Alexander and successful models from the past must have had their positive consequences. The example of mythical wandering heroes and gods like Heracles and Dionysus, in whose footsteps they could imagine themselves to be following, helped the Macedonians cope with the pressures of an alien environment. The foreign land was not really unknown. Their own ancestors had, after all, once passed through it victoriously. The cultivation of a mythical past was valuable for the Hellenistic present. Even the most far-flung foreign land traces of old familiar patterns could be discovered. Thus, the new world could be integrated into the old as something already familiar. The person of Alexander himself became in the end a new fixed point of the more recent past, which in its turn had an influence on the present. Alexander's deeds allowed him to grow in the eyes of contemporaries and descendants to a truly superhuman stature. Just as rulers and cities had tried to obtain a share in the Homeric epic, so they now strove to establish a link to this latter-day hero who had proved himself to be a true successor to the gods and heroes. Alexander became the focus of competition among kings and cities. Not only were genealogical claims made, but relics of the dead were highly prized. The desire to have a share in Alexander led Ptolemy I, for example, to stylize himself as a descendant of Heracles and Argead. What is more, Ptolemy was able to secure Alexander's corpse for his own capital, Alexandria, where Alexander later acquired the status of a founding hero and of a local guardian hero, who kept watch from his tomb over the future of his foundation. In the kingdom of Macedon itself, the genealogical connection to Alexander remained a central ideological element. Polybius describes the ambition of Philip V, who throughout his life had emphasized his family connection with Alexander. The hard-pressed Macedonian king Perseus is supposed to have made his ill-fated journey to the city of Pydna in 168 because he wanted to make a sacrifice there to Heracles, the ancestor he shared with Alexander. The past four kings, Hellenistic Pergamon. Alexander had already in the course of his campaign founded a number of cities. His successors carried this policy further. The establishment of new Greek cities in areas hitherto unexploited by the Greeks is probably rightly regarded as a particularly typical element of the Hellenistic period. The kings quickly recognized the significance of cities in the territorial exploitation of defeated regions. Many of these new foundations were not, however, actually new. Probably only very few were really planned on the drawing board. The places of settlement had, on the contrary, frequently already been settled and were now simply restructured by a Greek component in the population. Several cities acquired a completely new significance as a result. Their new political importance called for ideological underpinning. The past also played an important role for a Hellenistic new foundation. Newness was not a positive factor for the Greeks, just the opposite. This was true for most spheres, beginning with the inauguration of customs or laws which were attributed to the earliest possible ancestor and whose obligatory nature derived from their allegedly great age, and applying also to cities and tribes who liked to claim the greatest possible antiquity for themselves. In the course of the following discussion, the significance of myth for past and present in the Hellenistic period will be shown through two examples. Firstly, a royal capital. Secondly, the relationships between long-established Greek cities and others, hitherto only superficially Hellenized, situated at the edge of the Greek world. Greek myth and local tradition played an important role in the history of the city of Pergamon from the beginning of the Hellenistic period. Pergamon was not a new foundation of its first Hellenistic ruler, Philetairos. Traces of settlement go back to 2nd millennium BC. Already in the 5th century, a place called Pergamon is recorded in this region. The Persian king presented it to a follower from Eretria called Gongilos. But before the Hellenistic age, this settlement was probably not a Greek city. It could not be compared with the nearby Ionic foundations on the west coast of Asia Minor, rich in tradition. It never became a city with a purely Greek population. Funerary inscriptions show that. Even in its Hellenistic heyday, when a replica of the Athena Parthenos was set up in the Pergamene library, a large part of the population still bore non-Greek personal names. For the Hellenistic rulers who chose the city of Pergamon as their seat, the decisive factor was probably not some kind of ideological prestige possessed by the place, but rather the impregnability of its acropolis. The previous insignificance of the place, its existence as a settlement in Asia Minor in the backwaters of history, was appropriate to the humble origins of its new rulers. Philetairos, son of Adalos and Boa, came from Tyonon, a small city in Paphlagonia. His mother, Boa, did not even bear a Greek name. It shows the value which the Greeks attached to personal descent when the ancestry of the Adalid ruling family from Paphlagonia forbear could still lead to denigration hundreds of years later. Boa was abused by poets as a barbarian flute girl. After all, what good could come out of Paphlagonia? The rise of Pergamon to be the capital of a new, prosperous and liberal dynasty directed an attention never before known on settlement and ruler, and also on the history of both. The rivals with whom it was essential to be of equal birth were the other Hellenistic ruling families, with their claims to divine or at least Argead descent, and the neighboring Greek cities with an ancient cultural tradition. By the reign of Adalos I, who was the first Pergamene to take the title of king, the real ancestry of the ruling family and the real history of the settlement had long ceased to matter in dynastic and civic self-representation. Philetairos had sent donations on a grand scale to the most important sanctuaries of the Greek world, to Delphi, Delos, and Olympia, among others. His successors were a match for him in this respect. At the end of the 3rd century, in the sanctuary at Delos, a votive offering was donated which was of particular significance for the self-conception and self-representation of the Adalids, the so-called Teuthrania offering. The inscriptions on the basis of 5 or 6 statues give the name and parents of those person represented. That the Pergamene rulers Eumenes I and Adalos I appear here is not surprising. It is interesting, however, that the rulers of Pergamon are seen in company with eponymous local heroes from the area around their royal capital. One of these is Midios, son of Halisarne and Gyrunos. Midios can be identified as a hero of a place called Midapedion. Halisarna was already named by Xenophon as a place near Pergamon. In later sources, Gyrunos, the father of Midios, was explicitly described as founding hero of the sanctuary of Apollo of Grynion. The remaining inscriptions of the Teuthrania offering also give information about the mythological systemization to which the area around Pergamon was clearly subjected. One of them refers to personifications of local stretches of war. A final statue is a representation of Teuthras, called Teuthras by the literary sources. He was a well-known mythical hero of the region. According to the Attic traditions, he is king of a city called Teuthrania and stepfather of the famous hero Tethys. The inscriptions of the Teuthrania offering briefly mentioned here show how the system of mythological genealogy can be used for the mental appropriation, incorporation, and ennobling of a city previously of little importance, and how it allows the creation of new focus points. Features of the landscape are personalized in the form of eponymous heroes of the past and given a genealogical connection. On the basis of the preserved inscriptions of the Teuthrania offering, no direct personal genealogical connection of the royal family of Pergamon with the local heroes can be proved. Nevertheless, the family trees gather together local traditions from the surrounding area and bring them closer to the new royal capital and its rulers. Visually, at least, the rulers of Pergamon in the Hellenistic present and the local heroes are to be seen on the same level. The comparatively new rulers demonstrate their attachment to the region as if they had been settled there since the times of Teuthras' government. The Teuthrania offering is located not in the Mysian hinterland nor in Pergamon itself, but in the famous ancient sanctuary of Apollo of Delos. The whole Greek world is addressed there in the language of myth. The Attalid representation of the past was to go further than this. In another major Greek sanctuary, Delphi, the ruling family's connection to eponymous hero of Pergamon must have played a role. It is not clear whether Philetaerus, the founder of the dynasty, had this in mind when he made his donations to Delphi, but Attalus I surely drew on this when endowing the sanctuary at Delphi with a stoa. This building, the Stoa of Attalos, occupies a special position in the sanctuary. It is the only building allowed to interpret the Temenos wall, and consequently it is situated in direct proximity to the Heroon, or hero shrine of Pyrrhus Neoptolemus. Pyrrhus Neoptolemus played an important part in Delphi, but also quite fundamentally in Homeric epic and classical tragedy. At first he had not played a particularly credible role in Delphi. He is said to have burnt down a temple of Apollo because he blamed Apollo for his father Achilles' death. The punishment was not long in coming. Pyrrhus Neoptolemus died suddenly at the hands of a murderer in the sanctuary at Delphi. For the Attalids, this hero was special because of his mythological family tree. Through his father Achilles, the greatest Greek hero at Troy, he belonged to the first rank of mythical heroes. Even more interesting, however, were his descendants. From the Trojan booty he was awarded Andromache, the widow of Hector. He went with her to Epirus and fathered 3 children there, Pylos, Molossus, and a son called Pergamos. That the Attalids had knowledge of this genealogy of heroes is as good as certain, considering their well-known cultural ambition and their huge library. In addition, Pausanias records a double shrine for Andromache and Pergamus in the city of Pergamon itself. The proximity of the Stoa of Attalos and the shrine of Pyrrhus is unlikely to be due to chance. Pergamos of Epirus might at first sight appear to be a rather colorless hero, but the Attalids could see him in the eponymous hero of the city, or at least a relative, and such a connection was open to a particularly honorable interpretation according to Greek standards. The family tree of Pergamos made it possible to link the Adelaides with the most courageous heroes of both sides at Troy, to Achilles, and through Andromache also to the Trojan prince Hector. Andromache also belonged to a royal family of Asia Minor. Relationships to the ancestors of the royal family of Epirus also brought with it a relationship that reached right up to the Hellenistic present, with Olympias, the mother of Alexander. And just as Alexander had justified his claim to divine and heroic ancestry through appropriately heroic deeds against the barbarians, so Attalos of Pergamon legitimized himself too as a new Pyrrhus. During the Galatian invasion of Greece in 279, according to the Delphians, Pyrrhus Neoptolemus had joined the battle through an epiphany and repulsed the enemy. Attalos I, conqueror of the Gauls at the Caicus Springs, built his stoa not without reason in the neighborhood of the father of the eponymous hero of Pergamon. The local heroes of Mysia, as well as the eponymous heroes of Pergamos, in comparison to the founding legends and founding heroes of the famous old Greek cities, were rather pale figures. However, the emphasis placed on Mysian heroes by the Attalid kings, which took the mythological names of a whole area as the basis of civic identity, made possible the reevaluation of the Pergamene past with the help of a really prominent hero figure of Greek myth, Telephus. He had already entered the scene in the epic cycle as a successful protector of his homeland from Greek intruders, even the equal of Achilles as a warrior. Attic tragedy, and above all the drama Telephus of Euripides, had conclusively moved the fate of this hero into the best-known group of mythological material. At least since Sophocles played the Aeolids, it was also clear that the Mysian king, Telephus, was actually a Greek by birth, a son of Heracles, the greatest hero, and Og of Princess of Tegea. The first definite evidence for the appropriation of Telephus by the Attalids, and simultaneously the acceptance of the mythological ancestry by the Hellenistic present, comes from the year 209. The inhabitants of Aegina donated a statue of Telephus to Attalus I for a joint temple with the island's hero Aeacus. The reason given for this on the inscription was Attalus was related to Aeacus through his descent from Heracles. That the city of Pergamon had played no role in the whole previous tradition of the legend of Telephus clearly did not disturb anyone. The city in which Telephus is traditionally said to have been king was always called Teuthrania in the sources. A small place of this name existed in the Hellenistic period, but it was not identical with the Hellenistic metropolis Pergamon. But if Pergamon had in the meantime proclaimed the heroes of Mysia to be its own in the most important sanctuaries of the Greek world, so Telephus, king of Teuthrania, could also in this way become an ancestor of the Pergamenes and of their royal family. That the ancestry of Telephus did not, indeed, just relate to the family of Pergamon is shown by the existence of a civic tribal group called Telephus in the late Attalid period. With Telephus as their ancestor, the rulers of Pergamon had completed the historical connection to a past worthy of the new importance of their city. Appropriately, the heroes' adventures found their place on the Telephus frieze of the Pergamon altar. The comparison between this political representation of the myth and the written records shows a careful selection or adaptation of the mythological versions in circulation. Already on the larger frieze of the altar, Telephus's father Heracles appears in a central position. The smaller Telephus frieze highlights and gives especial importance to specific elements in the story of Telephus. For instance, when the infant hero was exposed, he was not, as he was still in Sophocles, suckled by a hind but by a much more royal beast, by a lioness. In addition, the Pergamenes placed particular emphasis on their hero's Greek origin. Other versions of the Telephus myth told that the child Telephus, along with his mother Og, was put out to sea in a chest and came to the Mysian coast from Arcadia via Nauplia. The native king Teuthras married Og and brought Telephus up as his son. The Telephus frieze tells a different story. After Telephus had been brought up in Greece, he came in as an adult at the head of a troop of Greek soldiers, potential founders of cities to Mysia. An adult son in search of his mother Og, the Tegean priestess of Athena, obviously corresponded more closely to the ideal of the Pergamene clients that the infant thrown on mercy of non-Greeks. Telephus, as ancestral hero, guaranteed the city of Pergamon, especially through his father Heracles, a connection with the Greek cities of the Hellenistic present, and once more with Alexander the Great. Even the origin of Telephus in the Arcadian city of Tegea, a rather insignificant place in Hellenistic times, could be useful in the matter of prestigious family connections. The Arcadians were regarded as one of the most ancient peoples in Greece, as ancient as the moon. The antiquity of Pergamene cults could also be reinforced through the Tegean connection. Telephus' mother Og was supposed to have brought the statue of the Tegean Athena Alia with her to Pergamon. And the myth of Telephus was also highly suitable for a Hellenistic dynasty. The founding hero was numbered among the Homeric kings and could trace his ancestry back to Zeus, the king of the gods. Telephus, son of Heracles and grandson of Zeus, had successfully defended his homeland Mysia against enemies from outside. His descendants, the king of Pergamon, produced the proof that his blood still flowed in their veins, not least by similar heroic deeds, such as their victories over the Galatians, barbarians who scorned the gods. Interesting in their treatment of their supposed civic history is the way the king of Pergamon linked up to local traditions. It is superfluous to give the reason for the choice of the Telephos legend, the need to turn to authentic local figures of the remote past. Whether the Pergamenes knew of the existence of Hittite mythical figure called Telepenes is more than doubtful. They linked onto a local tradition rather through the form set in advance by the Homeric epics. For Greek-speaking people, Mysia was above all the scene of epic events connected with the Trojan War. Every authentic memory was hopelessly inferior to this tradition. Even if the past of Pergamon in the Hellenistic period was fabricated, nevertheless it must be accepted that structurally any number of well-known mythical narratives of the Greek could have been considered suitable and appropriated accordingly. The Pergamenes did not, however, make arbitrary use of anything from the pool of stories available. A certain plausibility was required in the founding legend. It ought to permit an inherently logical integration of one's own city into the mythical historical system of coordinates that helped make up the Greek world picture. This was best achieved by recourse to pseudo-local tradition, by linking it to the picture of the landscape of Mysia drawn by epic. At this point, the question of the reception of Pergamene past and its success is posed. Did Telephos, as progenitor of the Pergamenes, get only an ironic smile in Greek cities and Hellenistic empires? Clear signs indicate acceptance of the newly arranged Pergamene past. The people of Aegina were hardly pleased about the new Pergamene rule in the year 209. Nevertheless, they erected a statue to Adolos with explicit reference to his relationship with them. This made it possible for them to save face, at least outwardly. One could also understand the reference to their mutual forbear as an appeal to the new rulers to behave towards Aegina according to the rules of family dealings. That the ancestry claim of the Pergamines also found sympathetic listeners on the Greek mainland is shown by the rejection of the city of Tegea, a mythical birthplace of Og and Telephos. Instead of jealously claiming the hero for their own history and rejecting the claim of the Pergamines as that of a usurper, Tegean envoys set off straight away for Pergamon with acclamations of approval. Tegea offered the Pergamines mutual citizen rights. The mutual conferring of civic rights on account of the family connection with Telephos lent Pergamon's model of its past official recognition and confirmation. That the Pergamines clearly gave the embassy from Tegea a friendly reception is not surprising. The motives of the Tegeans are surely to be sought both in the ideal and in the concrete sphere. Concrete was the hope that the Attalids would prove themselves as generous in the Arcadian town as they had been in numerous other cities on the Greek mainland. In the ideal sphere, a specifically Hellenistic development revealed itself. Tegea was indeed a famous old city, but as a medium-sized member of the Achaean League. It was a political lightweight. As in Pergamon, there was a certain imbalance between the current importance of the city and the past, to which they referred. But in the opposite direction, here a possibility began to emerge of balancing this out. If the Athena of Pergamon was a daughter cult of Tegea, this dependence raised the prestige of the Tegean cult to a considerable degree. What applied to the sphere of the cult also applied to the prestige of Tegea as a whole. To be the mother city of a Hellenistic royal capital and to possess a rich, famous, and influential daughter city certainly gave the Tegeans a considerable increase in self-confidence in relation to their neighboring cities and allies in the Achaean League. The emphasis on ancient family relationships was, however, not just the result of ephemeral political constellations and short-term opportunistic hopes. As the political relationships between the members of Achaean League to which Tegea belonged and Pergamon grew worse after 175, the Arcadian Telephos still continued to be highly thought of in Pergamon. The reasons of this are indeed obvious. Telephos was important for the Pergamines not because they wanted to curry favor with the Achaean League, nor even because they wanted to take advantage of the civic rights of Tegea. Rather, the mythical forefather Telephos gave the Pergamene dynasty in competition with other Hellenistic dynasties and empires the chance to mark out its own place. The Pergamenes did not seek to preserve the balance between past and present through short-lived political involvements, but through participation in the complex network of myth that spread across the Greek world. The Greek past for Cilician cities, the race for Argos. Not only Hellenistic royal families who wanted to claim a distinguished past as their own sought a connection to prominent heroes. In the Hellenistic period, a large number of cities suddenly began to emphasize their hitherto unknown Greek past with the presentation of mythical founders. The settlements on Cilician plain in southern Asia Minor offer an example of this. The case of Tarsos has already been mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. It claimed, among other things, to have been founded by the Argives as they wandered around together with Triptolemus in search of Io. Up to this time, Cilicia was far from being a center of Greek civilization. In contrast to Pergamon, its cities were not situated in the neighborhood of ancient Greek cities rich in tradition. The Cilicians were hardly touched by the Greek colonization of the 8th century, and until the 4th century they were under Persian control. From the perspective of a Greek from the motherland, the region was absolutely marginal. So inhabited by people who could not even speak proper Greek. The expression Soloikizen for someone with a strange and uncultivated accent was connected with the Cilician city of Soloi. In the Hellenistic period, a past was in great demand not only in Cilicia itself, but also along the whole south coast of Asia Minor. From Pamphylia to Syria, they all now suddenly remembered their own civic history. The first focal points of this memory are sometimes suspiciously similar. From Aspendus in Pamphylia, Soloi, Malos, Tarsus, and Aegea in Cilicia as far as the new Hellenistic capital of Antioch in Syria, a common claim united them. They were related to the city of Argos. Practically everything speaks against the legitimacy of such claims. According to our standards, they are not historically correct. The city of Argos did not feature prominently during the great Greek colonization. At best, Rhodian sailors and merchants had established occasional trading posts in pre-Hellenistic times. Soloi, for instance, could have been such a trading post. The Cilician cities claimed to a past did not, however, refer to the times of archaic colonization, as the Tarsian foundation legend already makes clear. It reached further back into mythical prehistory, when gods and heroes were acting in person as city founders. While no records of any kind referring to figures from Greek mythology are preserved for Cilician cities from archaic and classical times, that changed during the Hellenistic period. Tarsus did not indeed claim to have been founded by anonymous Rhodian sailors, but by the hero Triptolemus himself. New Argives. But what made the Tarsians, and along with them numerous other cities in the region, think of Argos of all places as their mother city? This fact is an important indicator of the shaping of historical thought by mythological characters in the Hellenistic period. Argos possessed in the ancient world a considerable and very special mythological prestige. Throughout the whole of ancient history, it was regarded as the homeland of famous mythological kings, and in Attic tragedy, it became the homeland of Agamemnon. Since Homer, the Argives were also famous as descendants of Heracles. Other important states in Greece, such as Rhodes and Kos, had for a long time proudly traced their ancestry back to the Argos of Heracles. The genealogical connection of Argos with Alexander, who for his own part had stressed his descent from gods and heroes, was not only of interest to the rulers of Hellenistic empires, but also to individual cities. The high standing of Argos lasted until Roman imperial times. The Emperor Claudius was still describing the citizens of Kos as Argives. If a hierarchy of the most distinguished cities were to be drawn up, educated people like Dion of Prusa were of the opinion that Sparta, Athens, and Argos were the first cities of Greece. The reference to Argives offered even further opportunities. The Homeric epics had created an ambiguity in the term of Argive. Argives and Achaeans were used there to mean the same. When someone spoke of Argives, they might mean the residents of the city of Argos, or the entire gathering of Greek heroes at Troy. Understood in such a way to be an Argive signified a connection with the Homeric epics and brought those so designated universal respect in the Greek world as genuine Greeks. The cities of the south coast of Asia Minor referred in this context especially to the many versions of the narratives about the homecoming of the Greeks after the fall of Troy. Amongst these were, for instance, the tradition of the Greek seer Calchas, who foresaw the shipwreck of the fleet and therefore refused to go on board. He went along the coast of Asia Minor towards the south with other heroes. According to some versions, he died in Claros in a competition with another seer, Mopsus. Other sources make Calchas travel further with his fellow seers, Mopsus and Amphilochus, along with other heroes, to Pamphylia, Cilicia, and Syria. According to popular mythological genealogy, none of those involved, with the exception of Amphilochus, actually came from Argos. The vagueness of the term Argive allowed them all, however, to become kings of the Argives. Reges Argivorum. Alexander and the Greek founding heroes of Cilicia. Why did the cities of Cilicia suddenly discover their mythical past in the Hellenistic period? Here again, the campaigns of Alexander seem to represent the deciding factor. As the Macedonian army reached Cilicia, the city of the area experienced different treatment. The city of Soloi unambiguously supported the Persians. She was punished for this. She received a garrison and had to pay an indemnity of 200 talents. On the other hand, Alexander behaved much more generously toward neighboring Malos. He sacrificed there to Amphilochus. Whether there was a sanctuary to Amphilochus before that time is unknown. The oldest records mention Amphilochus rather in connection with the neighboring city of Soloi. But for Alexander, it was obviously possible without difficulty to offer the hero a public sacrifice in Malos. Possibly interpretatio Graeca, the habit of recognizing Greek mythical figures in foreign mythology, played a role here once more. Whomsoever Alexander had identified as Amphilochus, the residents of Malos had every reason from then on to commemorate Amphilochus, and did this in the form of a complicated foundation legend. The discovery of the hero Amphilochus by Alexander gained for the Malians exemption from the taxes they had previously had to pay to the Persians. According to Arrian, Alexander had expressly given as the reason for his kindness to Malos the argument that the Malians were colonists from Argos. Amphilochus, as the son of Amphiaraus, originally came from there according to mythical genealogy. And the same passage states that Alexander had counted himself among the Heraclids from Argos. Even though Alexander, after battles in the surrounding territory, in the end also sacrificed to Asclepius of Soloi and held magnificent games there, still the emphasis on the old family connection and the prestige attached to it remained limited to Malos. The historical circumstances of the founding of Malos must have been just as familiar to the Macedonians as those of Soloi. According to the archaeological evidence, Soloi, which possibly had at one time been emporium of Rhodian sailors, perhaps actually had a greater right to boast of its Greek ancestry. However, it clearly did not depend on the real past. In comparison, the mythical, heroic version of the past carried much more weight than the reality. The preferential treatment of Malos by Alexander clearly brought local consequences with it. Mythological ambition was now awoken also in Soloi, which sought proof of its own mythological relationships. Apparently, embassies went directly to Argos and claimed the Argive seer Amphilochus for Soloi. They were successful, since privileges for the Solians in the Argive People's Assembly are attested by inscriptions from the end of the 4th century onwards. And Argos was not the only place that the Solians approached. The far-reaching echo of the Solian claim to ancient Greekness in the Hellenistic period is also reflected in Polybios. In the disputed with Rome, and the Rhodians gave support to Soloi, with the argument that they were both related and both came originally from Argos. The Solians had emphasized the connection with Rhodes through inscribed votive offerings to the temple of Athena Lindia. The sudden proliferation of foundation myths that followed the Macedonian conquest indicates how places which had previously been peripheral were now trying to shape their conception of the world according to Greek categories. In this attempt, however, they did not proceed in a purely arbitrary manner. For one thing, the link to Homeric epic again came into play. Over and above that, the presence of heroic seers in Cilicia cannot have been a coincidence. For centuries, the ancient Kizzuwatna of the Hittites had been a region of particularly sacred character in which purification and atonement rituals played an important role. If settlements like Malos and Soloi had gained prestige through stressing their alleged Greekness, which was rooted in the heroic past, clearly the important city of Tarsus could not be left behind in this matter. When Xenophon went through Cilicia in the early 4th century on the occasion of the Anabasis, he had, contrary to his usual practice, nothing to say about Greeks resident there. Before the campaigns of Alexander, Tarsus was apparently not recognized as a veiled Greek city. Nothing is known about Alexander's reaction to the cults of Tarsus. In contrast to neighboring Saloy, there was no direct epigraphic evidence that Tarsus sent embassies to the Greek motherland to seek confirmation of a prestigious foundation legend. Nevertheless, it is clear, not just from Strabo, but also from later sources, that the Tarsians wanted to be Argives. While Saloy and Malos put the main emphasis regarding their past on Greek seers who came from Troy, the Tarsians accentuated their past in a different way. Among other things, they claimed to be descendants of Triptolemus and the Argives who accompanied him in search of Io. In the city possessed Argive founders, then it also connected to Heracles and Alexander. At this point, we come back to the question posed at the beginning of this chapter. What had Triptolemus to do with Argos in the mythological tradition of the Greeks? What connected him to Io? Why do we hear now of an organized search for the Argive woman who, according to earlier sources, was driven across the world in the shape of a cow by a gadfly? In the classical versions of the Triptolemus myth, Argos was not even mentioned. Strabo is the earliest evidence for this. The hero Triptolemus, who had brought the world the Eleusinian mysteries and the art of agriculture, was from earliest times an Attic national hero. The Argive claim to Triptolemus appears first in Pausanias. Even before he went to Athens, he is said to have established mysteries of Argos. The search for Io is also first verified in the Hellenistic period. Here it seems to involve a further thinking out of the myth by Hellenistic scholars. The similarity in this case with another better-known story is only too clear, with the search for another of Zeus loves Europa. Just as Europa's father had sent out her brothers at the head of a band of men with instructions to bring their sister home again, and with the condition that they were not to return home without her, so now a group of Argives with a well-known leader went in search of the missing princess of Argos. Whether a relationship between Triptolemus and Io was postulated does not emerge from the sources, but would not be surprising. It was also said of the unsuccessful pursuers of Europa that they had founded cities in faraway places, since a return home without the missing princess was denied them. Where this version of the myth of Triptolemus and Io originated can only be conjectured. The forced linking of Triptolemus with Argos in another context, too, would point to the involvement of Argos itself. There are probably several reasons why the city of Tarsus thought up such an uncanonical foundation legend. Like the neighboring cities, it sought a connection with the Argives and therefore a kinship with Alexander. For the realization of this claim, the best contenders in Greek mythology were the migrant hero Triptolemus and Io, who is said to have gone to Egypt through Asia Minor driven by the anger of Hera. In this way, the Tarsian claim could be fitted to some extent logically into the Greek traditions. In addition, however, the local traditions of the Cilician hinterland may have inspired this Tarsian foundation legend. From the 5th century onwards, coins of Tarsus already bore an ear of corn. The Cilician plain was already famous for its fertility and for its abundance of corn under the Assyrian and Persians. The native god Baltars was, after all, represented with ears of corn and bunches of grapes in his hands. To recognize the Greek bringer of corn in him was natural. But it was not only the link to Argive traditions, conferring equal status with other Cilician cities, that Triptolemus made possible. The corn-bringer was also very popular in the Seleucid heartland of the Syrian Tetrapolis, which bordered on Cilicia to the northeast. Seleucus Nicator settled descendants of Triptolemus in Antioch. Much later, Libanius took up the tradition. Triptolemus is supposed to have finally settled in Antioch. The city of Antioch even pointed to the grave of Io, while Tarsos had to be satisfied with being founder by anonymous Argive companions of Triptolemus. Even in later times, they apparently did not possess a Harun, of a prominent founder. To be connected to an important royal capital like Antioch could not do the Tarsians any harm. Barbarian relations, the Argives on the Pan-Hellenic stage. The ambition of Cilician cities to find a familial connection with the most famous cities and the most ancient traditions of Greek myth therefore need not cause surprise. But how was this noble ancestry, the frequently attested aristocratic lineage Eugeni of the proud city of Argos, compatible with cities of highly questionable Greekness, which were suddenly knocking on the gates and wishing to be recognized as relatives of long standing? That the Argives wanted to make their glorious past productive in the Hellenistic present is demonstrated by the cultivation of their relationship with the Macedonian kings long after Alexander. The delegations from the fringes of the ancient Greek world also benefited from this attitude. They were clearly by no means turned away with disdain, nor fobbed off as discreetly as possible. Quite the contrary. The Argives bragged about their ancient connections in the eastern Mediterranean. This is shown, for instance, by an Argive decree from the end of the 4th century. The Argives not only granted citizen rights to the people of Aspendos, a Pamphylian city with a not too well established Greek past, but they expressly pointed out that the Rhodian and the Cilician Solians already enjoyed the same privileges as kin. 3 copies of the inscription were set up in prominent places: in the civic sanctuary of Apollo Laicus, in the Argive Heraion, and finally in the Pan-Hellenic temple precinct of Zeus of Nemea, a sign of the value that was placed on the publicizing of these familial connections. Kinship with cities of questionable Greekness in Pamphylia and Cilicia was, therefore, no longer something to conceal with shame. The behavior of Argos is particularly instructive here, as Pausanians certified that the Argives were filled with particular pride on account of their glorious past, and in this respect were in constant competition with the Athenians. Among the Greeks, the ones who compete most of all with the Athenians with regard to their antiquity and the gifts which they claim to have received from the gods are the Argives. So the changes in the Greek world picture reveal themselves not only in the dealings of the famous old Greek cities with Hellenistic kings. The city-states of the Greek motherland had lost political influence compared with the new territorial states of Alexander and his Hellenistic successors. Power and wealth were no longer concentrated in Greece itself. The centuries had shifted eastwards. Pamphylia, Cilicia, and Syria, along with the new Seleucid capital of Antioch, were no longer peripheral areas inhabited by semi-barbarians, whose strange dialects were a cause of merriment. Instead, they were prosperous areas in the immediate shadow of royal power, and it was worthwhile even for venerable cities like Argos to be bound to them by family ties. The expansion of the world in the Hellenistic present resulted in reordering of the past. The tendency of the Hellenistic period towards the systemizing of a world whose current upheavals no doubt seemed ominous to many revealed itself also in the systematizing of the past. the traditional tales of the Greeks proved themselves once more to offer constructive possibilities. Myth had never been a canonical text in the sacred sense. It was open to new combinations and new emphasis. It could be logically thought out further. And so the inclusion of the new structures of the present was successful, since their roots could be discovered in the past, and the hitherto marginal regions addressed in the language of myth responded swiftly. As participants in myth, numerous cities, from Tarsus to Pergamon, achieved integration in the new political systems which dominated by Greeks. Their integration occurred on the basis of familial connections with the retention of local features. The broadening of the mythic system of coordinates helped the inhabitants of cities with an ancient Greek tradition from Argos to Tegea to come to terms with the Hellenistic present by looking back to the mythical past. Further reading. The diverse approaches of research and interpretation on the theme of Greek mythology are outlined, for instance, in Bremer 1987, Edmonds 1990, Dowden 1992. Girk 1994 analyzes the relationship of myth and history. Also the collection of essays Posey and Wickersham 1991. To be recommended on the disputed question about the possibility of a historical core in Greek mythology is Patzek 1992, with its focus on Homer and Mycenae. Scheer 1993 offers a detailed examination of the role of mythical founders in Greek cities. Musty 1963, Curdy 1995, C. Jones 1999b, and Erskine 2001 discuss the use of myth in interstate kinship. For the imposition of Greek mythology and on non-Greek, Bickerman 1952. For further reading on Pergamon, Cosmetato, this volume on Telephos, Stewart 1996b, on the hero Pergamos, Cosmetau 1995, Isager 1998, and Lloyd Jones 1999. Publish an important recent inscription from Halicarnassus, which gives a sense of the place of local tradition within a community.